Good morning, everybody. It is time to go ahead and get started. As you can tell behind me, we're going to be in Exodus. We're going to cover the first two chapters of the book of Exodus today. Some of this I know you'll be hearing and you'll think to yourself, why didn't we cover this during the introduction? I get that. We had to do an introduction to the introduction, so that's, I guess, what last week was all about. But this is largely a historical section that kind of, in my opinion, lays the groundwork for the bulk of the book. And so when we get into these two chapters, much of it will seem like introduction, but I do think it's imperative to kind of understand what's happening in this book as a whole. Moses lays the groundwork for everything that's going to follow, and so it's important to kind of go through it step by step. Before we get started, though, I'll ask Sammy, if he doesn't mind, to lead us in a word of prayer. Amen. Thank you. Let's kind of start with just jumping right into it. None of these abstract questions, but what does happen in Exodus chapters 1 and 2? Let's just jump right into it. Talk about the hard facts. What happens in these two chapters? And you could say, according to my list behind me, you could have 12 different things and probably hit one of them. So don't feel bad about missing it. Yeah, Dad. It's an interesting word for Pharaoh, but yeah, they get a new manager, so yeah. Yeah, Moses supports them, so you nailed like 6 of them, so we got to get 6 more to go here. Curtis?
I was noticing how the midwives are giving instructions to kill baby boys on delivery. But it's interesting to note that they didn't because they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh.
Yeah.
They weren't entirely integrated into the Egyptian religious system, that they still feared God.
Yeah, and I think that gives credence to what we talked about last week with Moses. Why is it that Moses views himself as being a deliverer? Well, obviously he had to have retained some of that Israeli tradition that came from, or Israelite tradition that came from his mom. So I do think when you look at the midwives, you have kind of the same thing. And those 2 women, by the way, are named. They're Puah and Shiphrah. They're mentioned there in Exodus chapter 1. The only reason their names are given is because they're important for lineage purposes. And so if Moses is naming them, obviously somebody knew who they were down the road. So it is kind of an interesting little tidbit in there when you see that they feared God rather than feared the Pharaoh. John, go ahead.
God rewarded them for their reverence by establishing his house.
Yeah. And when you said that, I thought to myself, how did he reward them? And I remembered exactly what you said where before you said it, he established households for them, because that's a unique phrase. You don't really see that much, especially in regards to a woman. And so the fact that he says it about them, I think, is super noteworthy. And so, yeah, it's certainly a compliment to them. Levi?
Piggybacking on what Curtis mentioned there, it's something I had never really thought about before. But any other time I can think of in the Old Testament accounts of Israel moving around amongst other peoples, one of their common faults, I suppose, the way God sees it, is their integration with the people around them. And what I mean by that, not even just from a religious or cultural aspect, but intermarrying. I don't recall that ever being brought up in this context with the Egyptians. Is that a problem? I don't remember that ever being a problem.
No, but I do think you're going to see that become a problem in Exodus chapter 2 when it talks about interbreeding and how you kind of get the Israelite race out of Egypt. So that probably insinuates that there's something along those lines that's happening. But you're right. And I think also that gets lost sometimes in the Exodus too. When you talk about the great mass of people that are moving through the wilderness, that obviously includes 95% of them are Israelites. But you also got these hangers-on. And you mentioned, and you can see that because at various points in time, it'll reference, especially in Numbers and Deuteronomy, it'll reference like an Egyptian that's hanging around, or it'll reference like an Amorite that's laying around. So there are people that hang on to the Israelites as they leave, and it's possible that some of those were spouses that they attained in Egypt. What you do notice, that purification, especially taking hold in Ezra. Ezra, it makes a big deal about in Ezra chapter 10, where he tells everybody they needed to separate themselves, kind of keep that purity there. So that may not be an issue till later, but yeah.
One thing about that is when you go back to where Joseph brings Jacob and He tells them, let Pharaoh know that you're breeders of livestock, because the Egyptians dislike sheep tenders.
That's true too, but I think also they're realists in that they need meat, and so obviously they need them, but they don't like sheep.
They tend to keep it, it's almost to me like they tend to separate. The Egyptians don't want to have that much to do with it.
That's true too. I mean, there is separation obviously between the Egyptians and Israelites, but the fact that they settle in the land of Goshen, which is seen at that point as being the best of the land, that's what Pharaoh offers them. That's obviously, it shows that discrimination, if you can use it, is not really all the way to the top. It's probably not as popular, it's not as ingrained as it would be later. I don't really think you see the seeds of that type of discrimination happen until later, and I think that's what you see here in Exodus chapter 1. But at least initially, I don't think it's there to that extent. What else happens in Exodus chapters 1 and 2? We're kind of hitting everything around it, getting a good summary here. The goal always is to get the entire class done in 5 minutes so that we can just have the next hour off, obviously.
So Moses is born.
Moses is born, yes.
Mother puts him, she keeps him for 3 months or so.
Yeah.
Puts him in that basket, sends him down the Nile, and his sister is there, she's watching.
It's not as dramatic as, well, I guess it is as dramatic as that, but yeah, like any good autobiography, Moses is going to talk about where he entered the story, because obviously that's the most important part of it. And I say that tongue in cheek, but there is obviously Moses is an instrumental part of that story. Nobody would deny that. I think when you look at Exodus chapter 1 and 2, there's so many things that happen. This is what I mentioned earlier when these two chapters kind of serve as a summary for the rest of the book. There's so many things that are mentioned here in terms of relationships between Israel and Egypt. When you talk about the oppression, when you talk about the development of Moses, all these different things that really, I think, lay the groundwork for the rest of the book. So the Israelites increased greatly. There's Exodus chapters 1 and 7. That's a little bit of foreshadowing. That's exactly what God told Adam to do. Genesis chapter 2, be fruitful and multiply. You see that also referenced to Abraham. Go forth and multiply. Your descendants are going to be like the sand. That's especially contrasted with the first 6 verses. If you look at the lineage in Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 through 6, you have all these different tribes. Every one of these people are increasing. So now you've reached a point, by the time the Exodus happens, roughly around 2.5 million people. So there's a lot of people obviously taking place here. You have the new king, or as Dad said, a new manager arises. And also in verses 9 through 14, he afflicts Israel. Why does he afflict Israel? James? Yeah, because he feared them. And that's something I do want to talk about this morning, because I think when we look at this, we think, well, he just needs to learn to get along with them. And that's probably true, but there are reasons why he fears them, and I think that are rooted in Egypt's history. And so is it an unfounded fear? Probably, because there's no indication that Joseph was going to do anything bad for them. Why would his descendants? But nevertheless, he fears them because they're obviously huge and enormous. You have the threat of an Israelite infanticide. There's obviously a very similar corollary with what happens in Egypt in Exodus chapter 1, with what happens under Herod the Great in Bethlehem. The same exact type of thing happens where you're trying to kill all the boy babies, mainly so that you can eliminate any perceived threats to your own sense of power. So you have that happening there in verses 15 through 22. Moses is born and hid. Why is he hid? As Moses puts it, why is he hid? He's not the firstborn male, actually. I think Aaron would be, well, he's going to be killed. That's at least we know that much. Why is he hid, though? Moses describes himself as just too beautiful to be put out in public. So, yeah, he also describes himself later as the most humble man that ever walked the face of the earth. So you can make whatever you want to with those comments. Moses is born and hid because he's so beautiful. That comes from his words, not mine. Then you also have him adopted by the house of Pharaoh. This is another section that sometimes we think, well, obviously he's in the Egyptian house. Obviously he has certain privileges. He does. Hebrews 11 talks about that at length. What needs to be noted here is that his adoption into the house of Pharaoh is just one of many. There are many pharaohs that had upwards of 5, 10 different people in their harem. And so their children would obviously be very numerous. So Moses' adoption as a son of Pharaoh is good. It's obviously affords him a lot of privileges. Maybe not as much as sometimes we would assume, but nevertheless, he's living a very good life at that point. He visits Israel, then he kills the Egyptian. That's in Exodus chapter 2, verse 11 through 15. He flees to Midian, which, as we'll find out today, is literally on the other side of the known world. That happens there in verse 16 through 22. And then there's this little brief nugget at the end of chapter 2 where Israel cries out to God. God hears it, responds, and then you have the burning bush scene happening in chapter 3. Why is there all this information that takes place here in these two chapters? Why outline all of this? Which we're not going to do this point by point, in case you thought that's what this was going to be. Why outline all of these events in 2 chapters? You used my word to lay the foundation for what the story is going to be. I think that's exactly right. Why else do you think he puts all this information in there? What is he trying to tell future generations? Because that's really the point of Exodus, is Moses is trying to communicate their story to future generations.
He's trying to establish or show that they need to establish a relationship with God. Without God, it's going to be just left to their own devices, their own situation. So
Yeah.
he's saying, without God, this was not going to happen.
My thought process is along the same lines as what you're thinking of, which is we need to understand that there's a relationship with God here, that without him, none of this happens. I think that certainly takes hold in the last half of the book, where you talk about the tabernacle and the temple, or the priests, all those things. I do think that that's the focus, and so maybe the groundwork is laid here for that one. Why else talk about all this information? Let's ask a different question. What do they complain about so often during the Exodus? Food, yes. Cucumbers specifically, yes. Exactly. Life was so much better back in Egypt. And so by spending 2 chapters explaining just how terrible it is, he's reinforcing the point that these people are leaving something that was really not that great and moving forward to something that was so much better. And so I think anytime you're laying kind of the basis for a story and you're thinking this is where we came from, this is where we're going, you have to include the why. And I think the why is the main reason for all this thing. You have persecution, you have threats, you have oppression, you have discrimination. All these things are taking place in these first 2 chapters. Yeah, John?
When Pharaoh tells, first he tells the midwives to kill the boys,
Mm-hmm.
and then he makes a decree that they have to set every male child out to die.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But Pharaoh's got in his mind, the only thing I can come up with is that he wants to eliminate them. Period. Because once you eliminate the male, you just, there's nothing left to go with.
Yeah, and he is certainly trying to eliminate them. I don't think he's trying to kill the people necessarily as much as he's trying to kill the race. But the same point is seen there. He's trying to get them out of the equation in terms of a separate identity group. Because regardless of what civilization you have, 2.5 million people is a huge population density for one single area, region. So no matter where you live, whether you're talking about Rome, whether you're talking about Greece, whatever the situation is, you have that many people of a different race in your backyard, there's going to be tension there. And I think you see that quite a bit here. And so you're right. I mean, he's absolutely trying to eliminate them for all the wrong reasons. When you look at Exodus chapters 1 and 2, I think you have to put some important dates, important names, and obviously these are all very approximate. And if there is one section that in the entirety of the book of Exodus that is very much controversial, it's probably exactly what I'm about to throw up here today. If you have any other thoughts, if you say, well, I believe that it happened here, or I believe it was this person, that's totally fine. This is a rabbit trail you can go down for years, because most people, there is no definite indication of exactly when this took place. There's no definite indication of this being the exact Pharaoh. And so everything I'm about to tell you is approximate. There's a span of about 400 or 500 years that a lot of historians work with. That being said, if you take any other date, I think you have to make certain allowances that, in my opinion, are unfaithful to the text. And so that's why I put these ones up there. I'm trying to do this according to as much as what the information the Bible gives us. The Exodus date, you can see, I think, takes place roughly around the year 1445 BC. I know that because 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1 very specifically mentions that the dedication of the Temple of Solomon starts 480 years after the Exodus. I don't know why Solomon decided to date it with using the Exodus as kind of the starting point, but that's 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1. There's a lot of evidence that concludes the temple was finished around 965 BC, and so that's why you can take that name or that year back. It's 440 years, whatever 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1 uses. Then you also have Jacob moving to Egypt in 1875 BC. So you back up 400 years previous. You know that because you have Exodus chapter 12 verse 40 to 41 talks about the persecution being roughly 430 years. So that's how you can backdate that. You can also argue that Moses is born around 1525 BC because Exodus 7 verse 7 talks about him being 80 years old whenever the Exodus begins. And that's an important concept to understand about Moses. His life runs in threes. You have the first 40 years where he's in Egypt, he's a child of Pharaoh, he's just kind of doing what he wants. The next 40 years he's in Midian. The last 40 years he's with the Israelites in the wilderness. So his life is very much replicated inside of threes. There's some important names, and once again, these are just as much conjecture as the dates that I put forth for you. My research, and this is the best the conclusion I can come to, the oppressive Pharaoh here is Thutmose the first. Go ahead, sorry. I didn't expect to see a hand. Go ahead.
The significance of these dates that you're showing us up there is simply that, to me, is that the secular version of the Exodus wasn't in 1200 BC under Ramses II.
And that's another date, yeah.
So all the so-called archaeological finds that negate the possibility of Egyptians having left at all in Egypt, they're no good because the dates don't match up to begin with.
Yeah, the dates don't match up, and we don't have to go too deep into this, but I do think this is worth bringing up because a lot of the issues surrounding the dating of it precisely runs around, well, there's no evidence of the Israelites ever leaving. Well, there wouldn't be if you're the Egyptians. Why would you talk about losing 3 million people? You're not going to be a part of that. Then somebody would say, well, somebody else should talk about it. I don't have any clue about that necessarily, but there is two interpretations to this date when you look at the 430 years in slavery. A lot of people will say those 430 years includes the time that they're in Canaan in Genesis before Exodus takes place. If that's the way you interpret it, you're going to have a different dating system than the one that I'm going to use. I think the Bible says they were in Exodus 430 years. That's the way that I'm going to interpret it. But I am open to evidence. I'm not closed-minded on this. I think this is the best that I could do. I had to teach this class, and so I had to come up with something up there. Okay, because I was about to kick you out. So if I didn't know. No, I agree with you, and I'm glad that you brought that up because all of this is very much conjecture, including the pharaohs. Thutmose the first is seen as that. Ramses is seen as another opportunity or another option. If Ramses is the one that is the oppressive pharaoh, it doesn't make much sense to me that they're building cities in Exodus chapter 1 for Pithon and Ramses. Why would they name something after a pharaoh that hadn't been there? That's where I kind of come down on it. I'm sure other people could have different interpretations of it. Thutmose the first is sometimes seen as the oppressive pharaoh at the beginning of Exodus 1. That would place the adoptive mother of Moses, if you're taking purely the most sensational aspect, as Hatshepsut. I practiced that word before I got in here. That would be assuming to be his mother. I said sensational because there's some issues surrounding her ascension to the throne. She excommunicates Thutmose's son, which is Thutmose. I hate it when it does that. Jeff's not even here to give me his backup. There it is. Thutmose III. And so the assumption is that Hatshepsut kind of pushed Thutmose III out of the equation. He's very angry when he comes back into this situation after Hatshepsut dies. Then that kind of explains why he's so angry at everybody, why he hates the Israelites. That's the most sensational story. You could insert about 7 other names for each one of these things. And so I just put this forth to you as the most logical conclusion in my mind, but I'm open to any kind of interpretation. Anybody have any thoughts or comments on that? In my opinion, Exodus 1 and 2 kind of center around one verse. Let's see if this works. Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8, now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Why is this the verse that everything centers around?
That's the catalyst for which what causes the life circumstances for the Israelites to change in that land.
Exactly. That's the catalyst for change across the board. You have a king that rises up over Egypt who does not know Joseph, and so obviously he's going to act antagonistically towards Joseph's descendants. What does it mean when it says that he did not know Joseph? Doesn't know he doesn't aware of him. There's probably a monument in Egypt at this point for Joseph.
Joseph was responsible for foreseeing famine in the land and helping the Egyptians prepare for that.
Right.
And then the Pharaoh at the time understood that. And so he's responsible for saving a lot of lives, even of their own people. And if they don't realize that history, then who are these people that are camped out in the backyard?
Yeah, camped out. Who are these people? That should be a question for all of us. Who are these people? But you're right. I mean, Pharaoh, Moses, or Joseph is seen as the one that kind of guides them through the famine. We talked about last week kind of at length. There's that section there in Genesis chapter 49 where Joseph wasn't just responsible for that, but how he also essentially gave Pharaoh the whole of Egypt. He because of the famine, because the Egyptians didn't plan very well, Joseph exchanges a system where not only he takes their cattle, but also he takes their lands. There's an argument to whether or not he takes them as slaves also as the Egyptians. Essentially what he does is he binds up Egypt and gives it to Pharaoh. And so if there's one reason for why Pharaoh has as much power as he does, it's arguably because of that.
Well, the other thing to look at too, when the Pharaoh in the time of Joseph didn't just know Joseph and what Joseph did, but he knew, you remember, Joseph was constantly giving glory to God, showing that God was the one, when he interpreted the dreams and everything. I mean, he said this was from God, it wasn't from him.
Right.
So the Pharaoh at that time knew about God,
right,
and God's power because of what Joseph said and did.
Right, and the Pharaoh at that time has no problem giving that glory to God. He's just as cool with that as anybody else. That Middle Kingdom area of Egyptian history is where it develops less from this kind of idea of, yeah, go worship whatever God you want to centralizing religious authority inside who Pharaoh is. I mean, that's kind of the mythology that surrounds him. A lot of that develops in that Middle Kingdom area. By the time you get to the Exodus, Egypt is at its zenith. And so Pharaoh is seen as not only the head of the state because of what Joseph has done, but he also sees himself as the divine head of the state. But you're right, that's a huge shift from the Pharaoh of Joseph to the Pharaoh of Moses' time. There's a huge difference between the two of them. What else does it mean when he says he did not know Joseph? Because once again, it doesn't just mean that he didn't know who he was. What does it really mean? He didn't care, or he disregarded him, and the text actually has this kind of idea of an animosity, like I just hate you, or I'm willfully turning against you. There's an interesting kind of parallel with what you see in Judges chapter 2 and verses 6 through 10. It's mentioned there specifically that when Joshua dies and his generation dies, there was a generation in Judges 2 that rose up that did not know God, nor knew the deeds that he did for them. That's not an accidental statement. And so what it means in Judges 2 is essentially the same thing it means here in Exodus chapter 1, which is there's a generation that rose up, Pharaoh that rose up, did not care for what Joseph had done, more so decided to turn it dark against his descendants and exterminate all of them. They're essentially living for themselves. Anybody have any thoughts or comments? Yeah, Cameron?
It seems pretty reasonable that this would even happen because we see this today. Think about like World War II. There hasn't been that many generations since that, but so many people today don't really know anything about it, even though we have monuments, we have history books or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, so I can see this happening in Egypt. It's perfectly reasonable in my mind.
I mean, yeah. So you didn't mean to take that political, but my head went political. And so you're exactly right. I mean, there's lots of people that, with any separation, whether you're talking about 1 year, 100 years, there's a different story that surrounds the event. And sometimes that story can be twisted, manipulated. It can be used for your own benefit. You can be used for denial. So you're right. Joseph, or the Pharaoh that's around 400 years after Joseph has little regard for Joseph and probably for his own reasons, as you mentioned. Yeah, Gary?
We look at this passage in the context of God's plan for man that he put together before the creation. We can see the same concept you're talking about. As you said, the not knowing Joseph, disregarded what he had done.
Yeah.
So he didn't care. We see that with the Israelites later. We see that with the same concepts in the New Testament, where those that despise the cross. We don't care what Jesus has done. We've negated that.
Yeah, I don't, and that's mentioned, you mentioned there specifically that passage in Hebrews chapter 10. These are people who understand what Jesus did. They recognize it and may even acknowledge it as glorious. But it just doesn't have any relevance to them. And so Cameron's exactly right. I mean, it's the same thing happens in today's world where somebody rises into power. They have little regard for what came before them. And so they just diminish it and they elevate themselves. And it's not from a lack of knowledge. It's from a deliberate decision to forego what happened before you. Judges is the exact same situation. James mentioned earlier that Pharaoh is scared. What is Pharaoh scared of? That's why he didn't know them. That's why he doesn't like Joseph. What is he scared of?
The Israelites rising up against him in his own land.
He is worried about a rebellion. I think that makes total sense. You got a whole lot of people camping out in your backyard, as you mentioned. And so, obviously, a force of that magnitude, that could be a pretty big issue if it arises that way.
I think he's also worried that his influence and his popularity is going to be diminished because there's going to be so much focus on the Israelites because there's so many of them. So I think he was, on one hand, just worried about his popularity.
I think he is probably worried about his popularity, and that's where you can see, I think, a parallel with somebody like Pharaoh and also along the lines of the Pharisees and Sadducees, people who didn't want to lose their power. Yeah? I think what's interesting is when you look at this text specifically there in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 10, the exact reason of why he's scared just kind of jumps out at you. We have a lot of reasons why we would think he would be. Exodus chapter 1 and verse 10 specifically says, let us deal wisely with them or else they will multiply. That's what we don't want to happen. And in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us, and they will depart from the land. That's what they're really worried about. They're worried about insurrection and coups and things like that. What are they really worried about, though? Losing all their slave labor. If you have arguably the world's greatest economy at this point, which they probably do at this stage in development, you're talking somewhere in that 15th, 16th century BC reign. They're certainly farther along than Babylon or a lot of these other, organized civilizations. The last thing you want to lose is your entire labor force, the engine for your economy. But it's kind of a double-edged sword, because how are you going to keep them happy? How are you going to keep them in your land and yet also kind of safeguard yourselves against them? And the point that I wanted to make about this, when you think about this fear that Pharaoh has specifically about them departing from the land, is this is not an unreasonable assumption on Pharaoh's part. This may seem wild to us that 2.5 million people would just get up and walk out the front door. But if the dates are right, this exact same thing happened. It did it again. This exact same thing happened. I'm going to need a new battery for this. Actually, let me just steal Jeff's, because he's not even here. This exact same thing happened with the Hyksos invasion. Hold on. All right. I need a new AAA. This exact same thing happened with the Hyksos invasion. As you can see right behind me, you're looking at a wide range, 1782 to 1570 BC. The reason for that range is because the invasion of the Hyksos, which is a Semitic tribe from the east into Egypt, it wasn't a full-scale invasion that came all at once. It was such a slow burn, a slow development from these people, that they came into Egypt, they integrated themselves into Egyptian culture, Egyptian lineage, to the point that they even attained power inside of Egypt above even Pharaoh. And so there were all sorts of people that were looking at the Hyksos that not only were attaining power, but were helping develop agricultural systems and cultural systems. They just kind of coexisted until Pharaoh woke up one day and realized the Hyksos are about to dominate all of us from the inside out. This massive war erupted. The Hyksos are expelled from Egypt. That happened, if our dates are correct, about 100 years before the Exodus. And so when you're thinking about Pharaoh's fear in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 10, this isn't something that's unfounded. It literally happened 100 years earlier. So it's not an unnatural, irrational fear on their part. The Hyksos is so similarly tied to what the Israelites were doing or were thought to do that a lot of archaeologists think the Hyksos and the Israelites are the exact same people. Josephus is one of them. Josephus puts the Hyksos as the people of the Israelites, if you read any of his writings. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments on that? It's precisely that slow burn. That's what happened with the Hyksos. They just kind of came in, made buddies, settled down, and then they took power, and that's what Pharaoh didn't want to happen. And that's part of why Pharaoh has his issue with the Israelites. If you're going to exterminate an entire race of people, there's two options. You can, number one, work them to death. How would that exterminate them? How would that get rid of your problem? What's that? Through attrition. If you can eventually just kind of burn them into the ground, then obviously they're not going to be a problem anymore. If you look in Exodus chapter 1, you can see this take place. Look in verse 9. He says, the Pharaoh arises. He says, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more mightier than me. Come, let us deal wisely with them." I love how he says we're going to do this the wise way. "Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply. In the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us, fight against us, and depart from the land." So they decided to appoint taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor. They built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, verse 12, the more they multiplied and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously. They made their lives bitter with hard labor and mortar and bricks, and had all kinds of labor in the field, and all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. These are not just people that are using them as slave labor. They're sadistically trying to exterminate them from the situation by forcing them into labor that basically kills them. It's the exact same thing if you look at what the Nazis did with a lot of their work camps. It's the exact same type of thing. We're not going to put our people out there to develop those in Russia, so we'll take the undesirables, move them into Russia, and if they die, whatever, it doesn't really matter to us. That's exactly what's taking place here in Exodus chapter 1. What's the problem with this plan? When they persecuted them, what happened? Go ahead. I don't think there's any way you can look at this and not see the hand of God as being a part of this, primarily because this situation normally works. If you're trying to get rid of a race of people, just put them under labor, exterminate them, don't give them any food, don't give me water, triple their labors. But it didn't happen because, as you mentioned, they just kind of continued to multiply, which you see the same thing happening in the New Testament with regards to the church. Where do you see this with the book of Acts? This exact same thing. More persecution intenses, the more it multiplies. Where do you see that in the New Testament?
The spread of Christianity due to you say launching from, well, I guess it's a lot of, it's just a whole other factor, I should say. The existence of the Roman road at the time to get safe travel between cities, but you persecute the group in one city, and so
Right.
they flee that persecution and bring their ideals with them.
Mm-hmm.
Teach more people, and it happens again, and it happens again.
Yeah. If the Jews in the first century had been smart, what they would have done is, as soon as Acts 2 happens, they would have built a wall, and then they would make sure nobody got out, and then they would have kind of stamped it from the outside in. What they didn't do is exactly what you talked about. They put their foot down on the church, and as a result of that, it spread towards everywhere. And that's roughly the same type of thing you're seeing here in Exodus chapter 1, is we're just going to work you to death. But the more the labor intensifies, the more they multiplies. And I think Moses is writing this because I think he's trying to tell them, look, persecution is damaging, but it also has a multiplying effect. There's a pro and a con to both of these things that are taking place. What's the second attempt by these people to try and get Israel out? If you can't work them to death, what else can you do? You can do infanticide. You can infanticide them. You can kill all the boy babies. And I think you specifically talk about killing the boy babies because they're the ones that carry on the bloodline. And so that's what John was talking about earlier when he was talking about how that's the ones that you focus in on. If you look at Exodus chapter 1, starting in verse 15, it says, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, the other was named Puah. We talked about them at the beginning. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and let the boys live? I love the midwives' response here in verse 19. The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. In other words, Israelites are tougher than you guys are. Verse 20, so God was good to the midwives. The people multiplied, they became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Then Pharaoh, verse 22, commanded his people, saying, every son who was born you were to cast in the Nile, and every daughter you were to keep alive. The sons, the ones who are going to carry the bloodline, the name, throw them in the Nile. But the daughters keep alive so they can intermarry inside with the Egyptians, and you can kind of filter them out that way. Did either of these solutions work for Egyptians? No. As a matter of fact, it just made it worse for them. I think you can make a strong argument that what Pharaoh did to try and stamp out the Israelites just made it all worse. With the working them to death in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 12, and with the bloodline, it made their bloodlines and their people more populous because people don't care what Pharaoh has to say. There's where you can see the tension there. But the bloodline attribute also, I would argue, goes straight into the development of Moses. If Pharaoh doesn't institute this policy, what happens to Moses? And I know we're getting into some what-if territory, but roll with me here. If Pharaoh doesn't institute this policy, what happens to Moses?
He just gets raised as a regular slave.
He's just a regular Bill. He's probably still has dreams of aspiration. That seems to be who he is. But does he have the access and the power and the culturization that comes with being inside of Pharaoh's household? No. And that's what I think is so fascinating about this. And that's why I asked the question in the beginning, why does Moses include all this? It is to lay the foundation for the story of Exodus, but it's also to talk about the why. Where did Moses come from? Well, this is where he came from, this exact persecution. And I think that's noteworthy. Anybody have any thoughts or comments? I knew you did. Go ahead, John.
Moses was educated in the ways and culture and all that of the Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
So he knew the Egyptian culture inside out, especially the royal culture.
Right.
So when he fled and came back from God's command,
Mm-hmm.
he was the perfect person to lead that because he knew it. He knew everything about it.
He was the perfect candidate, and everybody knew that about him, but he didn't know that about himself. And that I think is something that's worth investigating when you look at chapters 2 and 3 kind of together. when you look at Moses' hesitations in chapters 3 and 4. But his background in chapters 1 and 2, as you mentioned, perfectly positioned him to be this person because he has essentially a foot in two worlds, three if you count Midian. He understands Jewish history very, very well. He also understands Egyptian culture and history very, very well. So he's the perfect person to kind of bridge this gap between the two different people. Curtis and then James.
Consider that because of his position in Pharaoh's house, it gave him audience to Pharaoh, which who else could do that?
Yeah, but I don't know if they knew who Moses was when he came back. That part to me isn't as clear, because it's certain that he ran to Midian because he was a fugitive, and at least he's there until, as Exodus talks about, the Pharaoh that sought him was dead. But would they still be looking for him 40 years down the road? I'm not entirely sure about that. But I think that's a fair point to make, yeah.
If Pharaoh hadn't have done these things to oppress them, then people wouldn't have wanted to leave.
Mm-hmm.
They would have stayed there. They would have been content to live there, be provided for, have a little bit of labor, 2 days' work, days' wage.
Mm-hmm.
I think the only time they started grumbling to God to leave was after they were oppressed.
Right. That's the other part of that too, which is Pharaoh's paranoia is what led to this whole cycle going downhill to begin with. And it's not entirely clear, and that's why I mentioned the dates at the beginning. It's not entirely clear when the persecution started, when Moses kind of fits into that story. Did the persecution happen for 10 years before Moses was born? Was it for 100 years before Moses was born? It does seem like a very natural development from Joseph to Exodus, but their persecution stems from Pharaoh's paranoia. And so I think that's exactly right. Levi and then John.
Just quickly point out an interesting, I don't know, contradiction possibly, not contradiction in scripture necessarily, but in Pharaoh's line of thinking. You just pick on the infanticide aspect of this. If he kills off, take this all the way through, if he's successful, and he kills off an entire generation of Israelite males, right? He has effectively eliminated their ability to uprise against any kind of fighting force they might have.
That's true too.
But he's also destroyed his labor force for the next generation.
That's true. I mean, certainly Pharaoh's not the brightest guy who was most forward-thinking person. But you're right. I mean, he is essentially destroying his labor force. I don't know if that part matters to him as much as securing what he views as, pure Egyptian culture. But I think that's a good point too. Not only destroys his labor force, but his warrior class as well. John?
Levi's point about if it wasn't been for the affliction, the Hebrews would have stayed in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And you can look at that and kind of see what happened with Cyrus.
Mm-hmm.
Cyrus tells everybody, you can go home.
Right.
You can go back to your homeland. And how many people left? Not that many. Too many of them were satisfied to be where they were. They didn't leave.
Yeah. And when Joseph, and that's a good point when you talk about Cyrus with the exile going back to Israel, there's no indication that that's ever going to take place here. But to that point, when you look at Joseph's first interactions with Pharaoh, Joseph is allowed to go back and bury Jacob. And not only does he go back, but an entire parade of people go back with him, consisting of all the upper echelon of Egyptian classes. So it's not a slavery situation at that point. As a matter of fact, it's a we owe you, how can we help you, Israel, as opposed to the opposite now. And obviously that happens in those 400 years. I think a lot of the reason that this whole situation is talked about, at least here in Exodus from Moses' standpoint, is it gives way to providence. For instance, it is providential that Moses is as handsome as he is, because if Moses was not beautiful, why would she have hid him? If he was an ugly baby, obviously that's a completely different story. But because he's so handsome, Moses' mom decides that she's going to hide him. Which, by the way, an interesting segue into this whole story. Moses' parents are Amram and Jochebed. Jochebed is actually Amram's aunt, if you look further in the book of Exodus. And that's all part of Egyptian or part of Israelite culture. I think you can see that. But that specific thing is outlawed, ironically, under the law of Moses. I thought that was an interesting kind of side point. If you look at Exodus chapter 3, the whole scene is just providence front to back. Look in verse 3. When she could hide him no longer, because once again, he's just radiant, she got him a wicker basket covered over with tar and with pitch, which, by the way, that's the bitumen pits. If you remember what we talked about with Sodom and Gomorrah, that tar pit, same thing that she's talking about there. Then she put the child into it, set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. So she fulfilled what Pharaoh said, throw the baby in the Nile. She did exactly that. His sister, which is Miriam, stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile. With her maidens walking alongside the Nile, she saw the basket among the reeds, sent her maid. She brought it to her, and when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. She had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." She knows exactly who this is. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew woman, that she may nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away, nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew. She brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. He became her son. And she named him Moses and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Providence is all over this section. How much of what we just read is providential? What's that? Well, that's exactly what I said. But you're right. Every bit of it is providential. What's providential in these verses, though? So much so that it can't be by pure accident. Go.
Moses' mother loosely follows the command of Pharaoh by casting him into the Nile, and then still ends up raising him.
Right. The fact that she throws him into the Nile, the fact that she then becomes essentially his nurse up until the ages of anywhere from 2 to 10, that's roughly the age range that we're looking at here. But it's also providential that Miriam just happens to be there, just happens to see Pharaoh's daughter, just happens to say, "Hey, I got a great idea. How about I go call a nurse for you?" What a fantastic idea, Miriam. The whole thing is just providential from start to finish. And I always kind of wonder, especially in these early years of Moses' life, just how much of this his mom told him. Because there's no question that when Moses gets older, and I don't mean this disparagingly at all, he has a savior complex. Because how does he view himself? I guess it's justified because he is the savior of Israel. Go ahead.
God has a plan,
He does.
and he works to ensure that plan goes forward.
Right.
And so the Exodus was part of God's plan.
It was.
To bring him out.
Yeah.
You know, so God was working to make sure that Moses was going to be taken into Pharaoh's house.
Yeah, and maybe that's part of what Moses is trying to communicate to Israelites, is he's saying, look, if God can make all this happen to the point that now we're at this juncture where we're leaving Egypt, then maybe don't be scared of persecution. Maybe don't be scared of the Canaanites or anything like that. I think that's a very relevant answer. How does Moses see himself? When he goes and sees the Hebrew being beaten up by an Egyptian, what does he think to himself? He wanted to be a defender. Exactly. Look in Acts chapter 7. It's so easy to just kind of keep going here in Exodus, but I think Acts 7 provides a little bit more commentary on the situation. This is when Stephen is obviously speaking, giving his defense. Acts chapter 7, starting in verse 22. It says, Moses, this is Stephen once again talking, Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians. He was a man of power in words and deeds. But when he was approaching the age of 40, that rings true especially in my life right now, it entered his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. When he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he defended him and took vengeance for the oppressed by striking down the Egyptian. And he supposed, this is the key phrase in verse 25, he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. There's a Jesus corollary. That's the point of Stephen mentioning this in Acts chapter 7. But verse 26, on the following day, he appeared to them as they were fighting together. He tried to reconcile them in peace, saying, Men, you are brethren. Why do you injure one another? But the one who was injuring his neighbor pushed him away and said, Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you not mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? At this remark, verse 29, Moses fled and became an alien in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. Moses 1,000% believes that he is the deliverer for these people. Probably has been told by his mom that there is going to be a deliverer that will free the people. He views himself as that person. And you can see it there in what he says in verse 25. And by the way, he was that person. But he also sees that in his relationship with each other. Why does he get mad at these Hebrews fighting each other? After he kills the Egyptian, buries him in the sand, comes back the next day, sees the Hebrews fighting each other. Why does he get mad about that? Exactly. Why are you fighting each other when you got an Egyptian that was literally beating your friend to death yesterday? Like, why are you guys fighting? And I'm not saying that this doesn't come from God, but I do think when you look at Deuteronomy, there's a heavy emphasis on brothers helping each other. Israelites standing up for each other, taking care of one another. I have no doubt that Moses at least feels very strongly about that idea. But Acts chapter 7 kind of paints this picture less in terms of, it just kind of happening, at least with this, as Moses 1,000% believing that he is the deliverer that's supposed to lead these people out. Obviously, Moses gets a little dose of humble pie because the people reject him, just as, once again, they rejected Jesus. And so what does he do? After he finds out that his brothers really don't want him to be the deliverer, which is, once again, a Joseph aspect, what does he do? He leaves. Not only does he realize that his brothers don't want him there, he also recognizes, according to Acts chapter 7, that word has gotten out that an Egyptian that was formerly an Israelite, everybody in Pharaoh's house would have known that, formerly an Israelite, killed an Egyptian to defend that race. That's the very thing that they were worried about in Exodus chapter 1 on a bigger scale. They didn't want an Israelite doing that to the Egyptian. And so what does he do? He runs, and he doesn't just run a little bit, he runs literally across the entire world, which ironically this map where he goes to Midian traces a really probably possible route of the Exodus. It basically goes the exact same way, which explains why when you look later in Exodus, Jethro shows up. He's in the neighborhood. Why not? I'm already there. But that's a very similar type of route that he would take later. Exodus chapter 2, starting verse 23. This is what I mentioned earlier about this little nugget at the end of this. It came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died. And the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage. They cried out. And their cry for help because their bondage rose up to God. God heard their groanings. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. The triple mention of God's notice of these people shows that he cares and he has concern for them. There's another Messiah allusion. Once the king over Pharaoh dies, he's able to kind of understand that it's a little bit easier way to go back if he wants to. Joseph is told the exact same thing in, I think, Matthew chapter 1. Herod's dead. You can go back home now. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments on this? Yeah, Gary?
It's an interesting parallel when we're talking about God using Moses to kind of represent a new era for his people. You go back and find almost the same language in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 14 with Noah.
Right.
Built the ark, covered it with pitch, and Noah was the person to begin the new era for God's people.
Yeah.
Very similar language here in the plan.
Yeah, and once again, to kind of build off that, deliverance through water, which is part of what Peter gets into in 1 Peter 3:21 when he talks about, just as we saw then, salvation or baptism doth now save us. Love the King James Version on that. But yeah, there's markers that are eerily similar for all of these different divisions. I think that's a great point. All right, we'll pick up with chapter 3 next week. Thank you, everybody.